Why did it take years? Why were these files not released during the last administration? Why did Congress have to pass an entire law to force the DOJ to make this public? And now that we finally have millions of pages, why now? Why suddenly cooperative in 2026? After being quiet, unavailable, unreachable, or just not complying for years while the files sat gathering dust? That's the question that people ask. And honestly, it's a fair one. It got so ridiculous that Congress had to pass an actual law, the Epstein Files Transparency Act, just to force the Department of Justice to do its job. Think about how insane that is. You need a law to get answers on one of the biggest criminal networks of our time. People don't want information, they want ammunition. They don't want clarity, they want confirmation. So the real question isn't, will the files be accurate? Or the real question is, will anyone accept them, even if they are? Welcome to Stay in the Fray podcast. I'm your host, Ryan. This is where headlines get hit hard, hypocrisy gets shredded, and the absurd are laughed at. If you want comfort, this isn't your place. If you want blunt and unfiltered, I'm your guy. Join me in the fray.
All you gotta do is just listen up.
All right, guys, here we go. Have to do this. The world, mainly this country, is still Epstein Files crazy. I didn't really want to do it. I really didn't, to talk about it to the show. But if we're going to do a show called Stay in the Fray podcast, at some point you can't pretend this mess isn't sitting in the middle of the room staring at us. Now, let me start with something before the comment warriors, you big bad trolls, before you guys warm up your thumbs. I've accepted a challenge from my producer, from myself, really, from friends of the show, from a lot of people, to put my own leanings as far aside as I can for this topic. They challenged me to do it a lot on different topics, but we're going to do it on this one. You already know where I stand politically if you know the show. I say it openly. I support the president. I'm rooting for the country and the good things that are happening, and I want the leadership that does what's right. But supporting someone doesn't mean I'm going to pretend to know the full truth of what happened on a private island 20 years ago. At the same time, I think hating someone doesn't magically make them guilty either. That's the world we live in now. One half is convinced Trump is some cartoon villain without a single piece of real evidence that ties him to Epstein, and the other half convinced that every Democrat is secretly running a basement cult. Calm down. I'm not going to do either of those things. Here's what we are doing. We're calling out the people who pretend they know exactly what happened. I call that lazy certainty. And it's everywhere. Headlines, influencers, social media activists, TikTok detectives who think a blurry picture from 1993 is proof. People who shout louder than the victims themselves. I've said this many times. Proximity does not equal guilt. You've met that neighbor who's like, I never guessed that he was a murderer. He was so polite when he borrowed the lawnmower. It does not mean that the neighbor helped him kill somebody. Humans are terrible at detecting predators. That's why Epstein got away with this for decades. He didn't operate with a neon sign over his head. Here's something people forget. When those early allegations surfaced, Trump threw Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago. There are even standing claims that he was the one who tipped off authorities. Does that prove his innocence? No. Does it justify strangers on the internet calling him a pedophile as if they've read the case files themselves? Absolutely not. Because the truth is simple. None of us know yet. We're all waiting to see what the files actually say. And that brings us to the real question today. The reason this episode will exist in the first place. Why did it take years? Why were these files not released during the last administration? Why did Congress have to pass an entire law to force the DOJ to make this public? And now that we finally have millions of pages, why does it still feel like the real answers are buried under black Sharpie ink? So we're going to do this. This is Stay in the Fray podcast. Let's roll. Let's start with the part that makes both sides squirm. Why did it take years for the files to come out? We can all agree on that part at least, right? Right or left, conservative, liberal, we all want to know the answer. Before anyone tries to turn this into a, well, it's because of them situation, let me just say it out loud. Both administrations have dragged their feet. and dragged their feet when it was Biden. Some of you won't like hearing that, but it's just true. The last administration had control of the Department of Justice for 4 years. Plenty of opportunities. Nothing came out. Silence. Not even a hint of urgency. And the crowd that was quiet back then is suddenly screaming, "Release the files," now that the roles are reversed. It's funny how Outrage has perfect timing when your opponent is in charge. Then now, the new administration comes along, same story. Admittedly, lots of speeches, zero transparency. It got so ridiculous that Congress had to pass an actual law, the Epstein Files Transparency Act, just to force the Department of Justice to do its job. Think about how insane that is. You need a law to get answers on one of the biggest criminal networks of our time. So the Department of Justice finally coughs up some documents. Not a handful, it's not a box. We're talking millions of pages. And still, somehow, we have more questions than answers. Because when you flood the world with information, but hide the parts that people actually want to see, it's not transparency, it's PR. Let me put it this way. If someone hands you a 3,000-page report, but half the lines are blacked out, that's not them giving you the truth. That's them giving you homework. And here's where the people get fooled. They see millions of pages released, and they think, well, that must be everything. It might not be. Redactions can bury just as much as withholding. The public keeps asking, where are the unedited flight logs? Where are the financials? Where are the visitor lists? Where are the communications? And why are certain categories conveniently missing or blurred beyond recognition? You don't hide innocence. You hide embarrassment, connections, leverage, or guilt. And at this point, nobody looks clean. Not the institutions, not the media, not the politicians on either team. So if you're listening right now expecting me to praise one side and crucify the other, not happening today. Not about this. I know I'm very good at it on the other issues. We're talking about a case that spans decades, 2 continents, multiple administrations, billionaires, celebrities, world leaders, and a justice system that's clearly would rather set itself on fire than hand you the raw truth. That is why the files took years, because no one, not Republicans, not Democrats, not the Department of Justice, not the media, wanted to be the one holding the match when the sparks started flying. And that's where we are. So the media circus, of course, erupted the second these files started coming out. Because depending on which news outlet you watch, you may as well be living in 4 different universes with 4 different truths, 4 different villains, and 4 different versions of what the Department of Justice even released. Let's start with Fox News. Fox is treating the release like a Super Bowl win for transparency. They're acting like this is the moment America finally rips the curtain off the elite. They've got graphics spinning, dramatic music, anchors looking like they've been waiting for this their entire careers. And look, they're not wrong to treat this as a big deal. But Fox is doing what Fox kind of always does. They focus heavily on names. Names that will rile up their base. Names that push the idea that the system is finally cracking open. But they leave out something pretty important. Just because a name appears in a document doesn't tell you why it appears. And not just Fox does that. Many others do as well. Fox rarely slows down long enough to say that part. They run with implication a little bit, not context all the time, when it's Democrats' names in play. Again, all media tends to do this. But we'll slide over to CNN. CNN is doing this thing where they pretend they're above all the chaos, while absolutely being in the chaos. They do that very well. Every segment is, well, yes, the files were released, but actually, let's talk about how complicated this all is. They suddenly turn into philosophers the moment something could touch anyone left-leaning. Where were all the very concerned, very nuanced explanations for 4 straight years? Nowhere. Now that it's politically useful, now they want full disclosure, right after ignoring it when their team was in charge. And they're obsessed with redactions. Every CNN guest suddenly becomes a forensic document examiner. We need to consider legal processes, security protocols, chain of custody, blah, blah, blah. The translation, they're nervous about what's in the unredacted parts. Now let's cross the Atlantic. The Guardian, Financial Times. I'll be nice because Great Britain has plenty of crazy issues within their own borders right now to deal with. But this one is hilarious because even though they are heavily left-leaning, they frame everything like it's a political chess match between American parties. As if the Epstein Files just another culture war storyline they get to critique from 4,000 miles away. They push questions like, Is this politically motivated? Are Republicans weaponizing this release? Probably. Democrats probably would too if the roles were reversed. That is not analysis, that is oxygen. But what The Guardian does best is sliding little insinuations in between legitimate survivor coverage. Why now? Why the timing? What's the agenda? Their readers leave thinking they just consumed high-level journalism when really they absorbed a well-seasoned opinion platter. Then you got Al Jazeera. Shockingly, or not so shockingly, depending how much you've covered that, Al Jazeera is the calmest voice in the room. They're reporting the timeline, quoting Department of Justice officials, sticking to the law, listing the page counts, the categories, the stuff that actually matters. They sound like the only adults at the table, honestly. It's basically, here's what the law required, here's what the Department of Justice said they did, here's what was released. No dramatic violins, no screaming, no finger pointing. Just, here's the info. Honestly, it's refreshing. So there you have it. 4 networks. After looking into all of them, 4 different worlds. One story that somehow manages to look like 4 different scandals, depending on which logo is in the corner of your screen. And it happens on more than just this issue, for sure. This is why the public is confused, why they're spitting at each other. This is why people cling to conspiracies, because when actual media refuses to agree on basic facts, the vacuum gets filled with social media detectives and Reddit warriors who swear they're the only ones telling the truth. If the mainstream can't even start from the same planet, the rest of the country doesn't stand a chance. Let's talk about the loudest people in the room. The influencers, the self-declared experts, the Instagram philosophers, the YouTube prophets, the Twitter warriors, all the people who somehow figured out everything about the Epstein case from their phone in the passenger seat of a Prius. This is the part of the episode where I'm going to upset both sides, and I'm fine with it. Because right now the internet is overflowing with people who swear they've connected the dots. Translation, they found a grainy photo from 1993 and decided they're basically the FBI. You got people saying, bro, did you see who Epstein, how he stood next to that person? Dude, that's body and language analysis 101. Really? You majored in psychology at the University of TikTok. Take it easy. And then there's the other extreme, the people who swear they know Trump is guilty. They call him a pedo. Based on what? A meme? A picture? Your cousin's roommate who once worked security in a hotel in Florida? You just want it to be true. People will turn a rumor into a religion if it confirms their bias. And how about this new trend where people think TikTok is banning the word Epstein? Platforms absolutely suppress words. We've seen it happen a lot. Trust me. But half the time, the evidence is someone typing a word into the comments. It disappears for five seconds, and suddenly they think they've uncovered a CIA operation. But here's my favorite type, the whisper influencer. The one who films their car, in their car, whispering dramatically like they're revealing nuclear codes. I can't say too much, but I have a source. Your source is Reddit. Stop. Now, I'm not throwing out every question that they may raise. Some of these theories come from real, observable things, somewhat intelligent people. People are noticing patterns, delays, names being repeated, documents disappearing, redactions that make no sense, connections that are too weird to ignore. Suspicion is earned in cases like this. The system created the mess. But suspicion is not proof, and influencers are notorious for skipping that middle step known as evidence. Here's my rule, and it's the rule I want everyone listening to try and adopt. If the evidence fits perfectly into your worldview, be more suspicious. Because that's not how truth works. Truth is messy. Truth pisses everyone off. Truth doesn't line up perfectly with your political team jersey. And right now, people are out here treating rumors as if they're sworn depositions. They're taking screenshots as if they're legal documents. They're playing detective with zero training and a ring light. Meanwhile, the victims haven't even been fully heard yet. Their voices are being drowned out by people who would rather chase viral clout than accuracy. And this is how misinformation spreads, not because people are stupid, but because the real institutions fail to be trustworthy. If you can't trust the Department of Justice, if you can't trust the media, if you can't trust the politicians, Who's left? Influencers swoop in like digital vultures, filling the void. They are no better than the institutions. They're just louder, more obnoxious. They're the ones who argue with the topic no matter what. I could post about the trade deficit being low, and they'll say, but Epstein Files. It's fucking annoying. And until we see the full files, unredacted, unfiltered, everyone pretending they already know the final story is just running on vibes, anger, and internet confidence. So all that being said, what do we know? And what's still missing? Because underneath all the noise, there are hard facts. They're ugly, they're disturbing, and they're heartbreaking. They deserve more respect than what social media gives them. Let's start with the absolute foundation of the entire case. Jeffrey Epstein himself, convicted predator, not accused, convicted. He pled guilty in 2008 in Florida to solicitation of a minor. Then he faced federal charges again years later. Then he was found dead in a jail cell in 2019 under circumstances that still make people raise an eyebrow. That is not speculation, that's documented history. Ghislaine Maxwell, convicted, serving time. She wasn't some innocent bystander caught in the crossfire. A jury looked at the evidence and made a decision. You may hate the sentence length, a lot of people do, but it's a conviction. It's real. It's on the books. So right there we have the central truth. A powerful, well-connected man ran a trafficking network with a woman who helped him do it for years, while billionaires, celebrities, and politicians orbited around them. That's what we know. Now here's where it gets messy, but still factual. Victims have started speaking, and none of them have named Trump as someone who abused them. Not one. Some have even said he was polite and kept his distance. That does not automatically clear him of anything unknown. But it absolutely destroys this reckless internet routine of calling him a predator with zero testimony to back it up. And as I mentioned, there's the Mar-a-Lago situation. People forget all the time, but there are multiple accounts long before the political war that Trump kicked Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago when early allegations surfaced. Some even claim he was the one who tipped off authorities, like I mentioned. Now, is every detail perfect? No. Are parts of the story disputed? Yes, like everything else in this case and more. But let me be crystal clear. It's a hell of a lot closer to distancing than it is to involvement. And that's a fact people conveniently ignore when they're foaming at the mouth trying to push a narrative. Okay, so what else do we know? We know Epstein didn't operate alone. You don't run something that big, that long, that much money flowing through your hands without help. And we know some of that help has been charged. Some has been questioned, some has been confirmed, and some, conveniently, fades into the shadows. We also know that several high-profile people were around Epstein, socially, financially, photographically, and that has fueled about 10 million hours of conspiracy content online. But here's the uncomfortable truth. A photo is not a confession. A dinner invite is not an indictment. A flight log is not a guilty verdict. Again, proximity does not equal involvement. And involvement does not automatically equal guilt. Some people visited his properties. Some knew him casually. Some knew him formally. Some benefited from his connections. And some, very clearly, got caught up in the swirl without knowing who he really was. Not unusual. Predators build power by appearing normal, sometimes even charming. It's how they get away with it. We still don't know the full list of offenders. We still don't know how deep it goes. We still don't know who actually did what. And anyone pretending they already have the list of villains carved in stone is lying, either to you or themselves, or both. So before the internet assigns halos and horns, let's keep our feet on the ground. There is a big difference between being around someone and being complicit. And until we see unredacted records, sworn testimony, and transparent sourcing, nobody, not me, not you, not influencers, not the media, has the right to declare guilt like it's gospel. So this is the part where some people expect me to bring a blowtorch out and start melting the Clintons right into the carpet. But remember, I'm not here to perform for either fan club. We'll talk about this like adults, finally. Bill and Hillary Clinton have now agreed to testify in the Epstein investigation. That is a fact. And yes, it happened after a long period of resistance, dodging, stalling, or whatever sanitized word you want to use. Could that delay be innocent? Sure. Could it be political strategy? Absolutely. Could it be fear of association? Wouldn't shock me. Could it be a legal team telling them, you know what, don't walk into anything unless you absolutely have to? Also very possible. So instead of screaming guilt or innocence, let's talk timing. Why now? Why suddenly cooperative in 2026? After being quiet, unavailable, unreachable, or just not complying for years while the files sat gathering dust? That's the question that people ask. And honestly, it's a fair one, because here's where the public loses their minds. If Trump is photographed with Epstein, boom, guilty. If the Clintons are photographed with Epstein, quiet mumbling followed by silence. If a celebrity was in his circle, people shrug. If a Republican was in his circle, people explode. It's not me being biased. Don't think I'm sliding back in for this episode. It's this selective outrage that makes everyone feel like they're being lied to. Look, the truth is this. People don't care about justice. They care about protecting their team when it comes to this. If the Clintons had testified 4 years ago, you and I both know the same people screaming today would have called it overreaction or political gamesmanship. But now that it's a different administration, suddenly transparency is the moral high ground of the decade. Give me a break. Let me say something that's going to make a few listeners uncomfortable, including myself to a point. The fact that the Clintons are testifying doesn't make them guilty. It was hard for me to say. And the fact that they didn't want to testify sooner doesn't make them innocent either. It just makes them political creatures with political instincts trying to survive a political moment. And that goes for every name caught in this mess, Trump included. Nobody's clean because nobody ever is in these elite circles. It's always donors, power, optics, leverage, reputation, and self-preservation. What people do instead is take whatever rumor fits their worldview and convert it into absolute certainty. If they dislike Trump, guilty, he's a pedo. If they dislike Clinton, guilty. If they dislike a Hollywood celeb, if they dislike billionaires, they're guilty too. And if they dislike a political party, somebody on their side is guilty. This case has become the ultimate Rorschach test. Everyone sees what they want to see. To me, I'll give you the most pressing question of all of this. How do we actually know if what gets released is real? How do we know it's accurate? How do we know it's complete or even unedited? Because when a case is this big, this messy, and this politically radioactive, trust becomes the rarest currency in the whole damn system. Let's start with the obvious. The DOJ has said, long legal language, files were processed, reviewed, redacted for victim protection, and released according to the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Sounds official. Sounds orderly. It also sounds like the exact kind of thing a federal agency would say when you're supposed to nod along and not ask questions. But let's ask the questions anyway. And this goes for both of the last administrations. Who actually checks their work? Is there an independent panel? A neutral review board? Is there a bipartisan committee verifying every line? No. There's the Department of Justice, promising that the Department of Justice did it correctly. And sorry, but the fox does not get to grade its own homework. So what happens next? Pam Bondi releases the next wave of files. She steps up to the mic. She gives the camera that polished legal assurance tone. She hands over the documents. Now pause here, because this is the moment where the public splits right down the middle. Half the country will look at the files and go, finally, truth, justice, I knew it, see? And the other half is going to scream, nope, fake, it's edited, they didn't release it all. It's bullshit, redacted, political hit job. None of this counts. No matter what it says, the divide will exist. And what determines who believes what? It's not the evidence, it's not the chain of custody, it's not the review process, not the context. It comes down to the same thing it always comes down to, who they like and who they hate. People aren't analyzing the documents, they're analyzing their own emotions. If the files come out and Trump is nowhere near wrongdoing, the Trump haters will lose their minds and say it's a cover-up. If the files come out and the Clintons look clean, the right will say it's censorship. That's not right. If the files paint anybody's favorite celebrity in a bad light, their fans will flip into denial mode instantly. This case is not about facts anymore. It's about tribes. You could have a sworn testimony with signatures and timestamps, and people will still argue that it's misinterpreted. You could have a document with every line visible except the victim identities, and someone would complain that the black marker was a shade too thick. And that's why this part matters. When the files do drop, fully, partially, however they shape up, the reaction will be the real story. Because the truth is not determined by what's in the documents. The truth is determined by who's reading them and what they already believe. That's why this episode even exists. This whole situation has turned into a loyalty test disguised as a scandal. People don't want information, they want ammunition. They don't want clarity, they want confirmation. So the real question isn't, will the files be accurate? The real question is, will anyone accept them, even if they are? So let's wrap this up. I'm going to bring all of it home, because this whole tangled mess leaves us staring down one question that nobody likes asking. Do we want justice, or do we want our side to win? You hate Trump? Then you've already decided that he's guilty. You hate woke liberals, like I do. You've already decided that the politicians who align with that ideology must be involved. I'm trying not to. You hate Hollywood elites? Boom. You got a list in your head already. You hate billionaires? They're your villains. It's become a choose-your-own-culprit storybook. But here's the truth that cuts through it all. Jeffrey Epstein was real. His crimes were real. His victims were real. And the network he built didn't vanish when he did. And while everyone fights each other online, the people who actually suffered get pushed to the background so we can argue about our favorite political characters like it's a Marvel movie. I'll spell this out. Justice doesn't give a shit about your team. Predators don't vote based on your preferences. And the victims didn't get to pick which party protected them or didn't. So when the Department of Justice releases files, when Bondi steps up for the next round, when names start circulating again, you're going to have a choice. You can act like half the internet and treat every new detail as ammunition for your favorite narrative, or you can do the harder thing. Look at the evidence. The actual evidence, not the memes, not the rumors, not the Twitter threads with dramatic music. You can demand full disclosure. You can demand unredacted truth. You can demand accountability for everyone, no matter how famous or politically convenient they are, because justice doesn't come from hating the right people. It comes from holding the right people accountable. Until we stop treating this like a team sport, nothing changes. The powerful stay protected, the guilty stay hidden, the media stays sloppy, and the influencers keep pretending they're Woodward and Birdstein with the phone camera. So here's my final word on the episode. Stop rooting for an outcome. Start rooting for the truth. And trust me, if these files ever come out unedited, the real story won't be whose name is in them. The real story will be who finally had the guts to face it without flinching. That's all we need on the Epstein Files. I guess we'll wait and see. Share this episode. Pass it along to anyone that's caught up in all this. I'm trying my best with this topic to really truly stay neutral. To try and say, I just want to know the truth. Of course, that makes it difficult, like I mentioned, to know exactly who's releasing what and how accurate it is, and if anything's hidden, covered up. Nobody's gonna cave. We've already made up our minds, and I'm gonna try to look beyond that as these things keep being released. And I encourage you to do the same. So, stay grounded, stay inquisitive, stay rational, stay in the gray. Love you guys.
All you gotta do is just listen up.